concepts of safe yield and sustainable yield of groundwater are analyzed and compared in the context of a hydrologic balance. All recharges and discharges are duly accounted for. Since groundwater is a flow, not a volume, tapping the nearly horizontal natural recharge may arguably compromise the rights of other users in the vicinity, including natural ecosystems, wetlands, and baseflow. It is surmised here that vertical recharge, that is, the recharge originating in local precipitation, is the only recharge that may be freely tapped for capture by groundwater to avoid encroachment on established rights. A methodology to evaluate vertical recharge is developed and tested. The methodology is based on the cybernetic hydrologic balance of Leibovich, 1979, including the definition of a groundwater recharge coefficient. This coefficient represents the fraction of precipitation that reaches the water table. Therefore, it may be used to evaluate and assess sustainable groundwater yield. Any amount of groundwater capture over and above the vertical recharge would have to demonstrate by means of suitable ecohydrological and baseflow studies that it does not significantly affect established rights. The question of how much water could be pumped from an aquifer and still remain sustainable has no straightforward answer. At first, the decision seems to be one related to hydrogeology. A careful examination, however, reveals that a host of other issues, among which some of the most significant are: how does the decision affect surface vegetation? How does it affect the relation between surface and groundwater? How does it affect pertinent water rights? How does it affect land subsidence and saltwater intrusion? In the past 2 decades, it has become patently clear that the sustainability of an aquifer has little to do with its hydrogeologic properties. Instead, the focus is now seen to be on ecosystem conservation and established water rights. This paradigm shift follows from the realization that groundwater is not a volume to be mined, but rather a flow to be acknowledged. In his seminal paper on hydrogeology, Thijs wrote in 1940, "All groundwater of economic importance is in the process of moving from a place of recharge to a place of discharge. Under natural conditions, prior to the development of wells, aquifers are in a state of dynamic equilibrium. Discharge by wells is a new discharge superimposed upon a previously stable system, and it must be balanced by A, an increase in recharge, B, a decrease in discharge, C, a loss of storage, or D, a combination thereof." In this video, we endeavor to make the case for the quantification of groundwater sustainability. We focus on the interdisciplinary nature of the problem. Detailed hydrologic studies at the watershed/basin scale will assist in determining appropriate quantities for individual cases. Groundwater flow is extremely complex, varying in space in 3 dimensions and time through various spans. Aquifers may be broadly classified as A, confined or unconfined, and or B, quaternary, alluvial materials, or tertiary, fractured rock. An assessment of sustainability will depend largely on the type of aquifer and the associated problem scale. It is very likely to transcend hydrogeology to encompass a gamut of related fields. Here we focus primarily on unconfined, predominantly alluvial aquifers of local or regional size as a first approximation to the analysis. At the outset, we acknowledge that all groundwater is constantly in motion from a zone of higher potential to a zone of lower potential, with the ultimate fate of groundwater being the nearest ocean. However, depending on the terrain's geomorphology, groundwater could eventually exfiltrate as the moisture of wetlands or the baseflow of rivers. It is clear that surface water and groundwater are intrinsically connected. Groundwater may actually become surface water in space and time, and vice versa. Therefore, exploitation of groundwater could eventually affect the surface water and other components of the hydrologic cycle in the vicinity. To further compound the problem's complexity, we reckon that a groundwater analysis suffers from a decided limitation. The size of the control volume is not fixed. Since all groundwaters are ultimately connected, defining the limits of a control volume is perforce an arbitrary exercise. Unlike surface water, which is constrained to the applicable watershed or basin boundary, there is no similar boundary for groundwater flow. Pumping without limit will generally result in an ever-increasing size of the cone of depression. Echoing Thai's statement, we reiterate that groundwater is not a volume but a flow. An arbitrarily defined control volume will have 1. Inflow, recharge, 2. Outflow, discharge, and 3. Stored volume of groundwater, water filling the soil or rock voids. Pumping constitutes an external demand, with its discharge originating in any or all of the 3 components mentioned above. Under this optic, 3 scenarios are possible. 1. A pristine system in its natural condition, in dynamic equilibrium, in the absence of pumping. 2. A developed system where the amount of pumping is equal to the increase in recharge, that is, capture-recharge, plus the decrease in discharge, that is, capture-discharge. 3. A depleted system where an additional fraction of the pumped discharge is actually being extracted from the stored volume. In this case, aquifer depletion takes place, with the size of the cone of depression increasing progressively in time. In a typical groundwater system, recharge consists of all flow entering the control volume. This amounts to 1. The natural nearly horizontal recharge, entering along the upstream boundary in the absence of pumping. 2. The captured nearly horizontal recharge, entering along the upstream boundary in the presence of pumping. 3. The captured nearly horizontal discharge, converted into recharge as a direct result of pumping. And 4. The vertical recharge, defined as the fraction of precipitation that reaches the top of the control volume, that is, the groundwater table, within the time frame of analysis. The vertical recharge may include amounts of artificial groundwater replenishment, rejected recharge, or return flows. Discharge from a control volume consists of 1. The natural nearly horizontal discharge in the absence of pumping, or the residual nearly horizontal discharge in the presence of pumping, exiting along the downstream boundary. And 2. Deep percolation, that is, the fraction of precipitation that leaves the control volume as a net vertical discharge, positive flux, at its bottom, only to join deeper groundwaters. Amounts of deep percolation are largely intractable and generally considered to be a relatively small fraction of precipitation, a global average of about 2%, and therefore negligible on practical grounds. In other words, deep percolation is the small fraction of precipitation that is effectively lost from the surface waters. The central issue of sustainability is the question of how much water to pump from an aquifer and still remain sustainable. In the typical case, aquifer replenishment is slow, taking decades, if not hundreds or thousands of years. Thus, it follows that excessive pumping of groundwater may lead to depletion and the consequent lack of sustainability. A depleted aquifer is one that cannot recover fast enough to continue to be of use. Therefore, it is unsustainable. Since an aquifer can be readily depleted through excessive pumping, it may be argued that the solution is to leave the aquifers alone and use only surface waters. Unlike groundwaters, the recycling time of surface water is a global average of 11 days. Therefore, all surface waters are sustainable when compared to groundwaters. This approach, while apparently logical, does away with the practice of groundwater pumping established for the past century in developed societies. We argue here that this extreme solution is politically incorrect. Groundwater use cannot and should not be altogether suspended. Rather, it should be regulated with the aim to manage, mitigate, and/or minimize depletion in order to best meet the challenge of sustainability. The discussion then shifts to the components of the groundwater balance. Where should the pumped water come from? We note that there is a caveat in the hydrologic balance. The water extracted by pumping could be either A. Consumptive, when none of the pumped water returns to the aquifer, or B. Partially non-consumptive, when a certain fraction of the pumped water returns to the aquifer at some point in time or space. Irrigated agriculture is the classical example of consumptive use, particularly when the drainage waters are collected and removed from the premises via surface flow. Other uses may be totally or partially consumptive, depending on the local situation. While the concept of sustainable yield has only been recently recognized, the admittedly older concept of safe yield has been around for nearly a century. In 1915, Lee defined safe yield as the limit to the quantity of water which can be withdrawn from an aquifer regularly and permanently without dangerous depletion of the storage reserve. He noted that water permanently extracted from an underground reservoir reduces the volume of water passing through the basin by way of natural channels, that is, the natural discharge. To illustrate the existence of this natural recharge, Lee observed that heavy pumping would commonly result in the drying up of springs and wetlands. Thus, he distinguished between a theoretical safe yield, equal to the natural recharge, and a practical safe yield, a lower value which takes into account the need to maintain a residual discharge. According to Lee, the residual discharge must be ascertained and deducted from the theoretical safe yield in order to obtain the practical safe yield. Over the past 2 decades, the latter has morphed into sustainable yield, which reaches beyond hydrogeology. How much should the residual discharge be when assessing sustainable yield? In cases where the captured discharge must be minimized due to the existence or claims of downstream water rights, it follows that very little or none of the nearly horizontal recharge could be captured without encroachment on the rights of others. Under non-equilibrium conditions, pumping 100% of the natural recharge could approximately result in the capturing of up to 50% of the natural discharge. Under equilibrium conditions, any amount of capture would come from discharge and possibly encroach upon established downstream rights. This bleak picture is somewhat ameliorated when it is recognized that the vertical discharge, that is, the fraction of local precipitation that manages to reach the water table, is not specifically included in the determination of nearly horizontal recharge. Thus, a resolution of the conflict of rights between surface water and groundwater could be the capture of any of the vertical recharge. This shift from capturing nearly horizontal to capturing vertical recharge is predicated upon the fact that nearly horizontal recharge is of regional scale, while vertical recharge is essentially of local scale. Under this spatial optic, all vertical recharge could be subject to capture. Moreover, basing the determination of sustainable yield solely on vertical recharge is likely to water down the argument that capture by pumping could negatively affect neighboring ecosystems and surface waters. In order to properly quantify vertical recharge and therefore gain a handle on sustainable groundwater yield, we resort to Leibovich's cybernetic hydrologic balance, an approach better suited for yield hydrology than the conventional one. In Leibovich's approach, annual precipitation is separated into 2 components, in which S equal surface runoff, that is, the fraction of runoff originating on the land surface, and W equal catchment wetting, or simply wetting, the fraction of precipitation not contributing to surface runoff. In turn, wetting is separated into 2 components, in which U equal base flow, that is, the fraction of wetting which exfiltrates as the dry weather flow of streams and rivers, and V equal vaporization, that is, the fraction of wetting returned to the atmosphere as water vapor. Runoff, that is, total runoff, is the sum of surface runoff and base flow. Combining equations 1 and 3, equations 1 to 4 constitute a set of water balance equations. 4 water balance coefficients may be defined. 1. Runoff coefficient. 2. Base flow coefficient. 3. Wetting coefficient. And 4. Recharge coefficient. These figures show runoff and base flow coefficients calculated by Pons and Shetty in 1995, based on data reported by Leibovich. It is seen that in all 5 cases, runoff and base flow coefficients increase with annual precipitation. The methodology described in the previous section is applied herein to data from the Sarada River Basin upstream of Anakapali in Andhra Pradesh, India. The basin is positioned between the Eastern Ghats and the eastern coastline of India and features a subhumid climate with a drainage area of 1,980 square kilometers. 11 years of rainfall runoff data are analyzed. The precipitation data consists of a daily rainfall hydrograph, and the runoff data consists of the hydrograph measured at the basin outlet. The annual hydrograph are used to calculate annual rainfall P. Each annual hydrograph is integrated to obtain runoff R. Surface runoff S is obtained by hydrograph separation using established principles. The matrix of PRS is used to run online water balance 2. This table summarizes the tabular results of the online program, where the groundwater recharge coefficient, K sub G, is given in column 11. This figure plots K sub G versus mean annual precipitation P in ascending order of precipitation. Despite the apparent noise in the data, the general trend is for an increase in K sub G with an increase in P. The vertical recharge coefficient is the fraction of precipitation that manages to reach the groundwater table. Given mean annual precipitation, and for that matter, given any amount of annual precipitation, the recharge coefficient may be interpreted as the amount of water that could be captured by pumping while assuring a sustainable yield. This strategy does not compromise any part of the nearly horizontal recharge or discharge. Note that the conversion of discharge to recharge in a control volume has been a point of contention in groundwater resource evaluations for many decades. For any one watershed/basin, the recharge coefficient may be evaluated following the cybernetic hydrologic balance described herein. Given the natural hydrologic variability in any one year, the sustainable groundwater yield, that is, the permissible amount of capture, could be practically based on the amount of precipitation occurring in the previous year. Amounts of artificial replenishment, rejected recharge, and or return flows, if any, may be added to the natural vertical recharge at this time. The concepts of safe yield and sustainable yield of groundwater are analyzed and compared in the context of a hydrologic balance. All recharge and discharge fluxes are duly accounted for. Since groundwater is a flow, not a volume, tapping the nearly horizontal natural recharge may arguably compromise the rights of other users in the vicinity, including natural ecosystems, wetlands, and neighboring baseflow. It is surmised here that vertical recharge, that is, the recharge originating in local precipitation, is the only recharge that may be freely tapped for capture by groundwater in order to avoid encroachment on established rights. A methodology to evaluate vertical recharge is developed and tested. The methodology is based on the cybernetic hydrologic balance of Leibovich, including the definition of a groundwater recharge coefficient. This coefficient represents the fraction of precipitation that reaches the water table. Therefore, it may be used to evaluate and assess sustainable groundwater yield. Any amount of groundwater capture over and above the vertical recharge would have to demonstrate by means of suitable hydrological and eco-hydrological studies that it does not significantly affect established downstream rights. The online calculator, Online Water Balance 2, rounds up the analysis.